Hello, developers, and welcome back to Elixir Pro. Today we are with the authors of Testing Elixir, Andrea, Leopardi, and Jeffrey Matias. Please, guys, introduce yourselves. Maybe first, Andrea.
Sure. So my name is Andrea. I'm based in Italy. I've been working with Elixir for a long time, maybe 6 or 7 years now. I've been in the Elixir core team for 5 years now. And I work at a company called community.com, which does messaging for community leaders and their communities and members in their communities. And that's all I got. I wrote the book with this other guy, Jeffrey, and that's what we are going to talk about a little bit, maybe. So, Jeffrey, go ahead.
So hey, I'm Jeffrey Matias. I'm based out of Denver, Colorado. I have been a software engineer since 2012. I've been working in Elixir since about, I think 2015 was the first time I got to put a application in production. And I made I made my career early on just by learning how to test really well. At the time I was working in Ruby, and that ended up shaping a lot of what I've done. And so when I got to the Elixir world, I was looking for kind of guidelines and a starting place on trying to figure out, how to approach testing, and kept feeling like there was a resource missing. And so when I started working with Andrea I'm at community.com with him now, but we were at a company called Weed Maps before that. And when I was working with him there, kind of mentioned to him that I thought that the community really could use a resource that, even if everyone doesn't agree, at least it starts the conversations. And so that's how Andre and I got into this whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah, the nice thing about this is that I was looking for Elixir testing book in Elixir, and I downloaded the book from Ruby because, like, previously I was working with C# and there was not a lot of content around it. I actually take a good look on the RSpec docs, but I really felt that was something missing. But yeah, this was the main idea. Do you think that the book give you what was the main problem you're trying to solve? Just like presenting the to the community this book, or there was something else that you saw? Oh, the way that people test is bad, and this might be the best approach for it. What do you guys think you help the community with the book?
I'm gonna let Jeffrey take this since he dragged me into this.
One of the challenges that I saw, because I'm at my, I don't know, maybe fifth company working in Elixir, is every time I come across stuff, for the people who are actually testing, first off, there's still people who don't test because they're not even sure how to deal with some stuff. You hear a lot of things about, like, I don't know how to test OTP or asynchronous things. But even for the people who were testing regularly, there just wasn't a lot of consistency in the way that they were writing their specs. And having come from Ruby, where there was there may be a couple different camps, but there was people pretty much, there were, a couple different ways, but there were fairly standard ways to see to expect tests written. And I think it's just helping people get consistency, because anytime that people do things a little more similarly or closer together, the easier it is to jump into somebody else's work. And at least me professionally, I've spent my entire career, working with teams and potentially inheriting applications from another team. So just trying to help have some consistency to the way that things are tested. And then again, there's lots of people come to Elixir and they feel like it's the paradigms are different enough from what they're working with that they don't know how to test things. And so I think it was just trying to answer those two. The biggest thing is just to get people talking more about testing.
Yeah, one thing that I actually addressed, I really like in the book, was like the helpers that you guys created for like once there's tuples, or there's like a map with the keys are not sorted correctly or something like that. This, like, man, I never thought it's for, and sometimes the test gets so ugly, and why didn't I just create like a helper that would help me test this thing? Like, because in the end, like if we were just looking for a set, we don't need, normally I would put a sort in both sides. Okay, now they are sorted. Now I can create an equals and if it will happen. So yeah. that was like a catch that it was like something that I'm not saying that like, I was genius, but man, like putting that on paper, like it put me, yeah, I should create my test helpers, and this will help me a lot.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that we should, people often wait for libraries to show up to do things for them, and with testing, you build your own tooling. I mean, it's if you keep coming across the same problem regularly, just figure out how to turn it into a thing. And we're at the point now where we have a lot of helper functions work-wise that like get copied between applications, and so I'm working on pulling those things into a library and putting them out, like the kind of tooling, the kind of little functions that you're talking about. Like I'll get those out soon. But I mean, those started 3 years ago, and or like the one for dealing with maps where you can't compare them, like a straight comparison, that's provided with the book. Like that's something that we started working on 3 years ago, and we've just tuned over time. There's it's got 20 different engineers have had some sort of input on it, and so it's fairly reliable and works pretty well now. But the biggest thing is that you make your own tooling, and then just make sure if you make your own tooling like that, that if things fail, the fail is clear, right? And that's it. And
Yeah,
and don't be afraid to just try it. Yeah.
it's pretty cool. Yeah, like
But
oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to add that Eduardo touched on something that I really love, which is that I think the one of the coolest thing about doing something like this, writing a book, is to give people ideas. It's not to tell them what to do, right? And in this case, for example, you don't have to write like you caught exactly what I mean. Like that when you read this part, it was not like, oh, I want to use this. It was, one of your, or at least one of your sentiments was like, oh, I did it, like I never thought about writing test helpers and just like abstracting that stuff, right? And that's exactly the sort of thing. Like I don't care if people use those test helpers or
Yeah.
do things the way we suggest to do them in the book, because ours are suggestions at the end of the day, right? But it's so cool that like we can expose people to ideas, and then I mean, people are smart. They're gonna like take what they need in their specific case and do what they need to do, but maybe they like we show them something that they didn't think about. I think that's the coolest thing. I my top one reason maybe to write something like this was definitely that, to like give people ideas, right?
Yeah, give back to the community. Nice thing about for the guys that are listening to this talk, the resources for the book, they are free. Actually, you can download from the Pragmatic Bookshelf, and you can see all these helpers. I think it's I think all the projects are using the first one. Like once you're testing external applications, there are some helpers. On the one from Phoenix, there are some helpers there. I think there are more helpers on the one in Phoenix this time of the first one. And I never actually got the point where I did the third chapter around OTP, but that's something that I plan to do in the upcoming days or maybe months. I'm quite busy at the moment. And man, actually, since I never even touched on subject on OTP, I haven't read the chapter. So what's your? I saw Andrea, you were in your Twitter. You were talking about some other developer, maybe last week or a week ago, that he was gonna create like a post on testing OTP applications, and then you were interacting with him. Can you just give me like an overall idea what's the approach for testing OTP? And because OTP is this thing from Elixir that everyone's afraid of. Every newcomer say, "Oh, OTP, that thing from Ericsson," and
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the big one of the there's this was the hardest thing definitely to write about, the thing, for me at least, and because the problem with testing OTP is that there is quite a lot of tribal knowledge if you go looking for it, maybe especially in the Erlang community, because Erlang's been around a lot, right? But it's hard to find it's much easier, let's say, much easier to find resources on things that are not related to testing these things, right? Like when talking about OTP, there's lots of resources about debugging live, about architecting OTP applications. Like there's more there than there is to testing. Like, or at least I definitely failed, and I think the reason is that testing OTP is really hard to have very easy to follow patterns and things that you say, okay, this is how you do this thing, right? I could not, like, in my experience with Elixir, it's always you got to figure something out for the specific case, right? And it was very, very hard to write about this because half of that chapter of testing OTP is like, sometimes I do things this way. It's not ideal, but it gets the job done. Like the tone of the chapter is all like this, and it's like that thing that I mentioned earlier about giving ideas. It's that brought to the extreme, right? Like I'm just like showing a few ways you can do. You can test these things, but without really prescribing anything, because there's nothing I feel comfortable prescribing, because the things are so vary from situation to situation. And the biggest challenge for me is always it's not even related to OTP itself. It's related more to testing asynchronous code, and to testing singletons, right? When you have like one single entity in your application, like a shared piece of state or counter or something, or thing that runs periodic actions, whatever. But when you have something like that does things in the background maybe, or does things asynchronously, those are the challenges, and not really OTP itself, because the tools in OTP are pretty, they're pretty thin abstractions on top of like asynchronous processes communicating with each other. And so I feel like the challenge is actually the asynchronous testing. Did that answer your question? I think that maybe
Yeah, no,
I
that's
went a little bit.
that's pretty good.
I, yeah, I want to call out that we each wrote individual chapters and then reviewed each other's work, and I was more than happy to let Andrea take on that chapter. But I think the biggest thing is that when you like by learning to test the various parts of the OTP, you definitely, I think more so than other parts of our applications, you learn how they work better. Most things we can treat like a black box, where you only pay attention to the input and the output. And you can get to that point with the OTP, like testing OTP, but you have to understand how it works enough to be able to even get to that place. And that's kind of why Andrea mentioned it. It's case by case. There aren't like these just, this is what you need, you use this pattern. Like there's a lot more nuance to it, but it forces you to learn it better. And that actually means that you can actually write it better in the long run too. So I think it's something that people should be afraid of. But you just have to try things is the biggest thing.
Yeah, testing
Yeah,
asynchronous
and the
code is
reason
a tough.
why,
Go ahead, Andrew. Go
sorry,
ahead.
I remember that you asked about the Twitter interaction, and I just want to address that the reason someone tweeted about that they wanted to maybe do a conference talk about like patterns for testing gen servers and testing synchronous code and everything, and I jumped on it because I was like, tell me, Jeff, I want to hear everything, because I like, if someone figures out like a kind of a packaged way of, or like a really designed patterns for testing this stuff, I'm all ears, because I had so much like, it was really hard to try to put those things as patterns, right? Because as what Jeffrey said, like it's very, you need to figure it out a lot of the time, kind of figure it out as you go. So that's why
Yeah, and I think the guy that you mentioned was one of the podcast hosts, right? I think it was the one from Elixir. Elixir, what's the one line? Not for Elixir Mix. Remember who was the guy from Twitter that you were talking about this talk? It was.
I am very embarrassed to say I have no idea, because I usually don't read. I just read the tweet and I replied. I have no idea. I didn't even look at the username or profile. I was so excited that someone had something to say about testing trend servers, and I just replied.
Nice, nice.
That's
Yeah.
my bad. That's my bad. I'll figure it out.
Yeah, like, later I'll put your Twitter account on the description below, and you're gonna get like more followers. But nice, guys. One thing that even though we have a topic on Phoenix, one thing that I was actually hoping that you guys were gonna tell something about was the Phoenix live view part, because it actually creates like an extra chapter around it. I mentioned before, like there is this course from German Velasco, which was like a former thoughtbot developer, that he created like this course as well. But you guys like has anything to say about that? That will be there coming upcoming content. What's your guys' idea?
You want me to take this, Andrea? So the book actually came out about 6 months later than it. So the book is about to come out right now, and we had about a six to 9 month delay in it, specifically because we were trying to figure out how to add sections on live view. One of the challenges with this book is that everything else we wrote was stuff that is this is a little bit of an exaggeration, but timeless. In that, we've been working on these patterns for several years. Andrea and I have both been working at least 5 years in Elixir. We've been developing these things. We've been working together for 3 of those years, and finding kind of the commonality in our testing styles. Live view is brand new and it keeps changing. And so it ultimately we came to the place where I started working on a live view app this time last year, specifically to be able to write that chapter. And in fact, you mentioned that you can get the source code from the book for free off of the Pragmatic Programmer website. And if you look at the application that's for the Phoenix chapter, there's actually live view in there. But like it doesn't have tests for it because I eventually backed out of it. What it came down to was that every time, like I couldn't find patterns that were that felt like in a year I could be confident that they would still be the right patterns. And so we ended up talking with our series editor, Bruce Tate, and turns out that he was working on a live view book, and it has a chapter on testing. And so, hate to say it, but we decided to let them carry that load. Part of it is that it's so new; it's just not stable yet. I definitely recommend people check out Herman Velasco's stuff. He also has a good book on how to TDD a Phoenix app, so test drive, which is something that we didn't touch in our book. It's how I work, but it's not necessary when you're trying to understand how to test, whether or not you write your test before or after. So I definitely recommend that people kind of keep an eye on him. He's putting out a lot of good content for that. And then there's that other book. But yeah, what it came down to is that I was struggling a lot, especially because the application that I wrote, was had multiple users that were supposed to be interacting with it. It was a game, and instantly I just ran into problems where the amount of state that I had to set up. What I ideally wanted to be able to do was just run through the game from two people's perspectives from a testing standpoint, and just have them taking turns and making sure that the views were rendering correctly with the right information. And it is not live views testing tools are still early. It does come with stuff, but they're still early, and there was no way for me to actually run two different views like that, for example, right? Right now, I think the biggest thing I would emphasize to people is put IDs on your HTML elements and just assert that it's there and check the content of it. And then you're going to need to do visual checks that things are actually, so that way you can make sure the data is on the page, and then you just have to run your application but yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, from where I got from actually I bought the German Velasco course, and yeah, he put like IDs and data roles. So like maybe the ID chain, the data role. So it's like two different things that the user can put on the developer can put on the HTML, so that it's easier to use the CSS selectors to exactly find like what kind of information you're looking for. But yeah, got it. Oh, pretty cool. I think I didn't have time to read the Bruce Tate book, but I know it is with Sophie de Bent. Sophie, I forgot her last name. But
yeah, I don't know if I've ever said it out loud. Sorry, De Benedetto?
Well, in Italian, it's De Benedetto because it's an Italian last name.
Yeah, and I'm missing letters.
But so, I have no idea how you would pronounce that in English. No, so I'm not even gonna try.
No, we no idea what the Americanized version of it is, but yes, it is with her, and she's actually got a strong background in teaching as well, and does a lot of writing on live view.
Yeah, I think she's I don't know if she's the owner of the Elixir School, right? Or
yeah, she's one of the major contributors to Elixir School.
Nice, pretty cool. Yeah, so like two solid backgrounds, like Bruce Tate and her. So yeah, that's probably a very good book around it. Let me think about like another question. So is there, like, besides live view, was there any topic that you think you could like you didn't address or you wished you would have addressed, and Or like, what else do you think what besides because the book like is amazing. There's a lot of things that you stress like external services, live view, like OTP, like a lot of good stuff in Elixir. But was there something that you guys, oh, maybe this was we would like to talk about this or...
Yeah, we had to work pretty hard to figure out what made it in, and there were a lot of things that didn't. I think for me, one of the biggest things that I'd like to spend more time on, and the solution is that we're going to just continue to add blog posts and stuff that kind of work as supplements for the book. One of the things that I'm looking at, and I'm even proposing a talk to the for the upcoming ElixirConf, US ElixirConf, is writing like using the factory pattern, but ways to do it where it's maintainable, that in 3 years you don't hate your factories. And it effectively at that point, it actually like, we call them factories, but they at this point they're pretty far detached from like the original Java factory pattern. It's more just a thing that inserts data into your database or returns specific kind of data based off of the way your application needs it to be formed. And so the real high level of it is, don't ever have implicit construction inside of your factory. Create pretty low level functionality in your factory itself, and then anything that needs to be built or nested should actually be defined in the test, or in a test helper, like in that same file. But so you should be seeing the even when you use factories, I highly recommend people do things a lot more explicitly in their tests and not implicitly through their factories. That because the reason they become hard to maintain in the long run is nested dependencies. It becomes a rat's nest of dependencies, and implicit builds and stuff like that. And so it means your tests get more verbose, but you still have this common place where the data for your application, your tests all have the same kind of concept or the same view of what the data should look like. And that kind of consistency can be really important. And that way, if you end up switching up how you implement things or whatever, you actually still only have a single source of how you're doing it. But I think that, like, I would like to, yeah. So I plan to write something and talk more about how to use that pattern, because I do think I see some people I hold in very high regard saying, just don't use factories, just do all your setup in every individual test. And that's too far in the other direction too for me, because A, it's slow. B, it means every time you get anybody who's new into the application needs to understand a lot more about it than they necessarily should have to, just to be able to write a test. So it's trying to find that sweet spot between giving standardized tooling and not having it do too much, still forcing some of the knowledge back into the test. So that's something I care a lot about, like just trying to help people build long run sustainable patterns. And there wasn't really a good, at best it would have been an appendix in the book. And at some point we basically, the feedback was, hey, like we kept proposing appendices, and the feedback was like, hey, you need to pick the most important ones and just stick with that. So
Got it, got it. And what about you, Andrea? Like, is there anything else, or like this?
Yeah. A lot of the stuff that I would have, I mean, well, not a lot, but I mean, a few things that I would have liked to maybe put in the book, but that we ended up choosing not to, are kind of reference guides. I would like, for example, I would like Elixir developers to know Mix very well, because it's surprising to me the amount of times that I call out the feature of Mix, like of Mix test, especially like Mix test dash dash slowest, and it's something like I use every day, and I wish more people knew about it. But you can't talk about, like, you don't want to write a reference guide in book because it's going to be outdated in like 1 year, and then what's the point? And it's like going to be mostly a copy of the documentation anyways, right? But like my sentiment was, I want people to know about this, and maybe if it's in the book, then they're going to read it. But then we decided to not put that in, so maybe that's going to be like highlight the blog posts that highlight features like that. That would be something that we might be doing in the future. And the other big thing that I wish we maybe made it into the book, but it makes sense that it didn't, was more about property-based testing, and especially because the content that is there in the book about property-based testing, it's only about stateless property-based testing, and it definitely it's an introduction to property-based testing, right? And I would have loved to give developers more kind of understanding of when to use property-based testing, and which is something that's very hard, like for me too, to be clear, which is when do I use property-based testing, when do I justify using property-based testing, and even more than that is stateful property-based testing, which I think is like the very fascinating kind of property-based testing, but the kind that is very hard to justify, because you have to build, like I used it a few times in like open source libraries, and you have to like build a thing, like it's a thing, you have to build a system to test your thing, right? So it's definitely not something you want to do every day. And so I mean, and it takes a lot of space to cover, I think, right? It's like a topic that you could write a book about. Turns out Fred Hebert, there's a guy in the Erlang community, I wrote a book about property-based testing. It's called can't remember, sorry.
Proper something
Proper.
like, yeah. I
Yeah, it's like if you yeah. It's a property-based testing with proper, I think, and it's for Erlang and Elixir developers. And I mean, that's one big reason, obviously, why I didn't even like think about going deeper, where we didn't even think about going deeper with property-based testing, because it's such a good resource on it already. But that's definitely something that I love, and I love talking about. So maybe that's something. But it makes sense that it didn't make it into the book. Other than that, I think what Jeffrey said.
God. Yeah, I think like the nice to mention this book, like this proper book, because there's this Elixir book group, and the next book I think will be the property based test. The first one was Bruce State's design system with wild worker bees. Maybe that's I don't know actually the right mnemonic around it, but yeah, I think it was something like that, which is an amazing book as well. But yeah, guys. So okay, anyone else like say anything else around testing? Because like I'm out of question. I would just like pop up the next thing that comes to my mind, and then we can keep working at it.
I have another thing that I wish we could have put in the book that there's no way that would make sense in a testing Elixir book, but it's because it's a much like more generic, I guess, and a much higher level. But it's my undying and infinite love for unconventional ways of testing. So this is something I'm trying to tell as much as I can, because there's a very strong focus in the developer community, I feel, that testing is automated testing. Like you have to write test, and that's your test suite, and that's what you use, right? And that's what you use for testing. And that's the testing. And instead, testing is usually, we've all done it in our lives, and it's usually.
Andrea, I think you're muted. Oops.
I muted myself by pressing space on my keyboard, I think. I have no idea how that happened. So sorry. But I was saying that we've all worked in this industry, and one very common way of testing things is just running the code in production, right? Like you just run the code and see what happens if something breaks. Well, like that's not a shameful thing to do, right? Like that's a very, very, for me, a very, very valid way of testing things. But it's not talked about, because it's like, yeah, like this is the cool kind of testing, is the automated testing, or the end-to-end testing, or this is like the things that you can run, and the CI and all of that. And instead, I think that there's a whole world of testing that you can do, and that sometimes is the thing that makes the most sense, right? Like in my experience, a lot of time, this is like, what I like to mention is the 80-20 rule here, where with 20% of the effort, you can go 80% of the way there in your automated testing. But then if you want to cover the last 20% with automated testing, you're going to spend like 80% of the time working on the test suite, maybe, right? Or coming up with weird ways to test things in an automated way, when, maybe testing things, like production testing, or however we want to call it, or I'm not just talking about that. I'm talking like, anything you can think of where you do, partly automated tests, or end-to-end tests where you write tests in a different language that just exercises your whole system, or, different tests in CI just so that you cover parts of things, but only in CI. Those are all very valid things that I don't think are talked about enough, or discussed enough in the programming community, not in the Elixir community, to be clear. But they are things that are very generic and like philosophical. I think I would not find interesting maybe in a book about testing with Elixir, which is maybe more specific to Elixir, but I would have loved to put more in the book about that. I'm very passionate about that. But
we spent a while talking about that too and trying to figure out like what level that it could be covered. But ultimately, one of the things we struggled with was that when we made a lot of decisions, it came back to is this something that'll help people specifically understand Elixir? And at that point, no, it's more about talking about your entire system, right, and trying to figure things out. But it's amazing the number of times I've worked with companies with very competent developers that I've had to help enforce a standard or define a standard that when you deploy your well-tested code, the immediate next thing you do is you actually just verify that your feature works in, if you have a staging environment or a dev environment first, and then rolling it out and just run your code, right? And so that's the very first step of what Andrea is talking about, and then trying to get bigger than that, right? Figuring out like what other patterns do we have here that don't belong in an X unit test suite but are still important, right? So yeah, there's definitely some more content that could be written along those lines.
And you both mentioned like you're gonna create this new content. Where you intend to like post this blog post? Do you have like your own blog post? Is it on Medium, or maybe if you wanna? I don't really know. If you
No,
guys
that's a great question. Yeah.
Where are you gonna post like this new upcoming content? Where or you think you're gonna post?
So Andrea and I both are going to be doing it on separate places. Andrea, what's your site's URL?
namelastname.com, andrealeopardi.com.
Yeah,
and then I've got to get on it, but I will be spinning things up at testingelixir.com.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Yeah, I'm gonna put both of these resources on the description below as well.
Then I better hurry up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, guys, I think like just like understood like he's gonna have like the next meeting. I think we're gonna wrap up for today. Is there like any last words that you'd like to say? Like maybe where to follow you guys, something like that. I'll go for that. Like
Sure.
Andrea, go first.
Sure. So if you want to follow me, it's at what you hide on Twitter, and on GitHub and all over the internet as well. If you have any questions about the book, if you want to ask me anything, feel free. And if you have, I say this every time. If you find any typos in the book when you buy it, please don't tell me. I will be very sad because now it's printed and I can't do anything about it. So this is what I try to say every time. So I really appreciated all the reviews. We got like amazing reviews. Actually, Eduardo helped with the reviews as well, like with a lot of really good comments. Now we can't do anything. So now there's nothing we can do. So it's just gonna make us sad. No, I'm just kidding. Like there's gonna be an errata page, I think. So feel free to. If you have any questions about the book or anything, I'm happy to try to help if I can.
Yeah. Sounds good, man.
And I am at Idle Hands, all one word, on Twitter. It's the same on GitHub, but don't bother following me there. I don't do anything publicly impressive at this point. And aside from that, just go test things. Like I. And you know what? People can hit me up. My DMs are open on Twitter. If you're struggling with how to test something, write me.
Sounds amazing, guys. It was like an awesome interview. Thanks for showing up. Thanks for spending this time with me, and hope we can get together like soon enough. So, thank you. Bye bye.
Yeah.
Awesome.